What really happened during the longest war of all time? Welcome to Collapse, where history changes forever. Today, we delve into the shadows of a titanic conflict, a war with 1,000 faces, where treacheries, crowns, and steel blades intertwine in a never-ending struggle. The 100 Years' War, a devastating confrontation between two rival kingdoms, France and England, a century of battles, raids, and revolts that forever changed the face of Europe. Here is the story of a century of fire, where legend mingled with destiny. But before embarking on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to miss nothing. Thank you, and safe travels. In the early 14th century, the world was undergoing transformation. Societies were gradually emerging from the medieval surge to enter a more politically, economically, and culturally structured era. Yet, communications remained complicated, and each major region of the globe evolved according to its own pace, rivalries, and ambitions. The trade routes, although developing, were known only to a small group of merchants and explorers. Western Europe, at the beginning of the 14th century, found itself in a phase of expansion and reshaping. The kingdoms of France, England, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal were evolving according to shifting power dynamics. France, under the Capetian dynasty, was a complex feudal ensemble where the king had to work alongside powerful dukes and counts. England, on the other hand, maintained a more centralized monarchical structure while being marked by a strong tradition of baronial opposition, inherited notably from the Magna Carta, signed in 1215. This charter, imposed on King John Lackland by the rebellious barons, set the first limits to royal power and asserted certain feudal rights, paving the way for a political culture where the nobility claimed an active role in power control. These two powers already had a shared history, since William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, became King of England in 1066. Their entangled feudal ties regularly generated frictions, particularly over territories such as Guyenne in the southwest of France. In the far west, Ireland and Scotland, though more peripheral, were not immune to influences or invasions from England. Each of these regions had its own feudal particularities and languages, but all shared the belief that political order rested on a king, vassals, and a nobility attached to land and war. At the heart of this Europe, the papacy held a central role, both religiously and politically. Since the pontificate of Clement V, elected in 1305, the papal court was established in Avignon, in the south of France, and would remain there until 1376. This episode, known as the Avignon Papacy, gave the Pope an ambiguous status, no longer in Rome, but in a city close to the French crown, which fostered suspicions of French influence on ecclesiastical affairs. The Church was then a powerful institution, benefiting from large domains and considerable revenues. Kings and princes relied on the Pope to validate their marriages, confirm their legitimacy, and arbitrate certain conflicts. The cardinals, often recruited from the great families of Europe, formed a pool of important political and religious advisors. This period saw the rise of monastic and military orders, such as the Dominicans and Franciscans, who traveled the continent to preach and teach. Some orders, like the Teutonic Order, were also engaged in military campaigns in Eastern Europe. Thus, the decisions of the Avignon court directly impacted the power dynamics in many kingdoms, adding a spiritual dimension to political rivalries. Another major element of European geopolitics in the 14th century played out in the Holy Roman Empire. This eclectic ensemble, which included multiple duchies, counties, free cities, and ecclesiastical principalities, extended from present-day Germany to parts of northern Italy. The emperor, who claimed to be the heir to Roman imperial dignity, had very variable power, depending on the territories and the era. The prince-electors, high-ranking secular or ecclesiastical dignitaries, elected the emperor, making the title complex to obtain and retain. At the beginning of the 14th century, different families, such as the Habsburgs and the Luxembourgs, struggled to assert themselves. Relations with France and England were often influenced by matrimonial diplomacy or the occasional need for military support. Sometimes, alliances formed to counteract papal influence, or conversely, to gain the Pope's support in internal imperial disputes. This mosaic of local powers could lean one way or another, depending on whether the reigning emperor succeeded in imposing his authority or if, on the contrary, the princes preferred to ally with foreign kings. Further south, on the Iberian Peninsula, corresponding today to Spain and Portugal, the early 14th century was marked by the continuation of the Reconquista, that is, the reconquest of territories occupied by Muslims since the 8th century. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal gradually made progress southwards, where the Emirate of Granada remained the last major Muslim stronghold in the region at that time. Alliances were formed between these Iberian kingdoms and other European powers, with the aim of continuing the fight against Islam, as well as ensuring their own internal stabilization. Castile, for instance, was then a powerful kingdom in demographic terms, and Aragon was already looking towards the Mediterranean, where it controlled strategic islands like Majorca and Minorca. On its part, Portugal, confined to the west, began to build a maritime identity that would later serve its great explorations. This rivalry between Iberian kingdoms, coupled with battles against the Emirate of Granada, forged a cultural space still distinct from the rest of Europe, where Arab, Jewish, and Christian traditions coexisted more or less peacefully. Meanwhile, the Italian peninsula was divided into a multitude of city-states and ecclesiastical territories. Genoa, Florence, Venice, and Milan were all flourishing urban and commercial centers. At the dawn of the 14th century, Venice was already expanding its network of trading posts in the eastern Mediterranean, forging links with Levantine merchants. Florence, dominated by great families such as the Medici, who would emerge a little later, was establishing itself as a banking and artisanal center. Milan, under the Visconti dynasty, struggled to extend its influence in Lombardy. These cities were often torn between Guelphs, supporters of the Pope, and Ghibellines, supporters of the emperor, political and ideological factions that fueled local rivalries and wars. In the south of the peninsula, the Kingdom of Naples, also called the Kingdom of Sicily at different times, was embroiled in complex dynastic quarrels, sometimes linked to the House of Anjou, occasionally to the Aragonese crown. Despite these divisions, Italy played a key role in international trade, importing spices and luxury goods from the east, while exporting textiles and artisanal expertise to the rest of Europe. Turning to Eastern Europe, we discover a significantly weakened Byzantine Empire. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire is but a shadow of what it was during its golden age. Constantinople, once the great capital of the Eastern Mediterranean, was occupied by the Latin Crusaders from 1204 to 1261 and struggles to regain its former might. The Byzantine emperors must deal with external threats, primarily the expansion of the Ottoman Turks, who have taken root in Asia Minor and are already eyeing Europe. Internally, the empire suffers from recurrent political divisions, with aristocratic families vying for the throne and cities seeking to escape imperial authority. Further north, the kingdoms of Eastern Europe, such as Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, solidify and begin a slow but real expansion. The Teutonic Order, a Germanic military order, has settled on the shores of the Baltic Sea and attempts to forcibly convert the pagan populations of Prussia and Lithuania. the Teutonic Knights thus become a powerful factor in the region, arousing both admiration for their discipline and fear for their warlike methods. In the Muslim world, several sultanates exert their influence, each with its own objectives. Egypt, under the Mamluk dynasty, positions itself as the center of Muslim power in the Levant. Having taken control of Cairo in the mid-13th century, the Mamluks are former slave soldiers turned sovereigns. They maintain an army reputed for its heavy cavalry and its knowledge of the desert. Their authority extends over Syria, Palestine, and occasionally certain regions of Arabia, constantly remaining in tension with the Mongols of the Ilkhanate in Persia, and with the merchant powers of Italy, such as Venice or Genoa, which covet the spices and other precious goods transiting through the Near East. In the Anatolian Peninsula, in Asia Minor, several Turkish beyliks emerge, including that of Osman I, founder of the future Ottoman dynasty. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Ottomans are still just a modest regional power, but their strategic position, located on the border with the Byzantine Empire, offers them many opportunities for expansion. Over the decades, they conquer new fortresses and gradually nibble away at Byzantine territories, thereby laying the groundwork for the fall of Constantinople a century later. Across the vast expanse of Central Asia, the Mongol Empire, which had dominated much of the continent in the 13th century, fractures into several rival khanates. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227 and his grandson Kublai Khan in 1294, power becomes fragmented. Notably, there is the Golden Horde, settled on the Russian steppe north of the Black Sea, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia. Each Mongol entity experiences its own succession disputes, allying with or opposing neighboring powers. Despite this fragmentation, the period of the Pax Mongolica promoted exchanges along the Silk Road, allowing goods, travelers, and ideas to circulate from the Mediterranean Sea to China. Marco Polo, at the end of the 13th century, illustrates this phenomenon by having traveled the route to Kublai Khan's court. At the beginning of the 14th century, tensions among the various khanates and the emergence of new regional actors such as the Ottomans, however, begin to undermine the solidity of these great commercial networks. In East Asia, China is governed by the Yuan dynasty of Mongol origin until 1368. The Yuan emperors oversee vast infrastructure projects, including the maintenance of the Grand Canal that connects the north and south of the empire, and encourage trade with Central Asia. However, the Mongols in power provoke resistance among the Han Chinese elites, leading to sporadic revolts. After several decades of unrest, the Ming dynasty takes power in 1368 under the leadership of Zhu Yuanzhang, the dynasty's founder. This major transition brings changes in state organization, affirming China as a military, political, and commercial power in the region. On the other side of the East China Sea, Japan is, at the end of the 13th century, under threat from Mongol invasions initiated by Kublai Khan. These attempts fail in 1274 and 1281, notably due to typhoons, called kamikaze, meaning divine winds, that destroy the Mongol fleet. In the early 14th century, Japan is governed by shoguns, military leaders, who exercise power on behalf of the emperor. The Japanese feudal system, based on the power of daimyos, great lords, and samurai, has little contact with the West, but maintains limited trade relations with China and Korea. In Africa, while the northern part of the continent is largely under the control of Muslim kingdoms in connection with the Mediterranean world, West Africa flourishes through prosperous empires such as Mali and later Songhai. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Mali Empire reaches its peak under the reign of Mansa Musa, who ascends the throne in 1312. This empire spans a vast territory, controlling the gold and salt routes, two essential resources for trans-Saharan trade. The great cities of Timbuktu and Gao become centers of exchange and knowledge, where Arab merchants, scholars, and literati meet. Camel caravans connect West Africa to North Africa, and from there to the trading cities of southern Europe. Further east, the Nile Valley is dominated by the Mamluks of Egypt, who work to preserve the trade flows coming from the Red Sea. The sub-Saharan region remains largely outside of direct European influences, but maritime trading posts begin to appear on the eastern coasts, frequented notably by Arab and Persian merchants. Finally, in the Americas, great pre-Columbian civilizations develop without significant contact with early 14th century Europe. In present-day Mexico, the Aztecs are on the rise in the Lake Texcoco region. In the Yucatan Peninsula, the Maya civilization, although already ancient, still experiences notable activity in certain city-states, even if its brightest period belongs to previous centuries. Further south, in the Andes, the Incas are on the verge of building a vast empire with Cusco as its capital. Their terrace farming techniques and their political organization in ayllus, kinship groups, enable them to dominate a vast territory. All these civilizations cultivate a rich culture, developed arts, and hierarchical social structures. However, the lack of connected maritime or overland routes to the Old World ensures their isolation and delays the major cultural shock that will follow the arrival of Europeans in the 15th century. At the beginning of the 14th century, France and England are two powerful kingdoms in Western Europe, each governed by a complex feudal system. To fully understand the origins of what will become the 100 Years' War, it is essential to comprehend the political and social structure of the era, then dominated by ties of vassalage, internal rivalries, and a very precise conception of royal legitimacy. In the early 14th century, France is a kingdom whose territory has gradually expanded under the Capetian and, a bit later, Valois dynasties. The King of France, theoretically the supreme suzerain, does not, however, directly control the entire kingdom. Powerful vassals exercise their authority over their own lands, sometimes with great autonomy. Among these vassals are first-rank lords, such as the Duke of Burgundy or the Duke of Brittany, who enjoy almost sovereign independence in their duchies. The ties of vassalage, woven through oaths and homage, determine a large part of the political balance. Vassals pledge allegiance to the king, promising military support and loyalty, while the king is supposed to protect them and guarantee their rights. In practice, this organization can lead to tensions. A duke or count, despite his oath of vassalage, often seeks to expand his domain to strengthen his financial or political power and may come into conflict with the French sovereign. Some of them enjoy immense resources, thanks to rich lands or locations on strategic trade routes. In France, a mosaic of territories emerges where the central authority, though real, is sometimes contested. The crown, in the person of the king, has been working for several generations to consolidate its authority, notably by relying on royal advisors, the church, and matrimonial alliances capable of reducing the influence of overly ambitious great lords. Across the Channel, early 14th century England is an island kingdom with a powerful monarchy. Indeed, since the Norman conquest of 1066, the reigning family has developed a solid administration, relying on institutions such as the King's Council and local justices, greatly differentiating its internal organization from that of the Kingdom of France. The King of England thus has more direct power over his territory. though a number of lords and barons retain significant prerogatives. This does not mean the absence of internal rivalries. English barons are often powerful and do not hesitate to revolt against a sovereign they deem unjust or too oppressive. However, compared to the multiplicity of great French vassals, the King of England more easily manages to levy regular taxes and mobilize an army, which gives him a significant advantage in a context where war essentially revolves around ransoms, subsidies, and land rents. The relations between the English monarchy and the French monarchy cannot be understood without going back to the 11th century, when in 1066, William the Conqueror, also known as William of Normandy, invaded England and seized the crown after the Battle of Hastings. Before this date, William was the Duke of Normandy, a vassal of the King of France. From the moment he also became King of England, an immediate problem arose. A lord holding lands in France and pledging allegiance to the King of France also became sovereign of another kingdom. Mechanically, this dual status favored conflicts of interest and rivalries, as the King of France could demand homage for the Duchy of Normandy, while the King of England sought to maintain his authority in the British Isles. Yet, both titles were conflated in the person of William. This situation persisted with the descendants of William the Conqueror. The English monarchs are theoretically vassals of the King of France for their possessions on the continent, notably Normandy until the early 13th century, and then Guyenne, also called Aquitaine, whose control is a source of regular tensions. The question of suzerainty, meaning the supreme authority to which one owes obedience, is hotly debated. Can a king be the vassal of another king? From the French perspective, the answer is yes, as long as he possesses territories in France. From the English perspective, it is often a reason for rebellion and opposition, as accepting homage to the French sovereign amounts to recognizing a form of institutional dependency, if not consenting to the legal and fiscal interferences it entails. The ties between France and England are not confined to Normandy. They extend through a complex web of royal and princely marriages. Since the late 12th century, the Plantagenet family reigning in England accumulated vast continental possessions: Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine, not to mention Normandy before its reconquest by the French king Philip II Augustus in 1204. Marital unions between princes and princesses of the two kingdoms helped to seal alliances, but also to engender new succession disputes. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, after being Queen of France through her marriage to Louis VII, became Queen of England by marrying Henry II Plantagenet, which suddenly transferred a vast duchy in southwestern France to the English crown. On the French side, the Capetian dynasty, extremely keen on maintaining the kingdom's coherence, seeks to strengthen links between the great fiefs and the crown. The organized marriages sometimes aim to attach a duchy or county, or sometimes to neutralize a competitor. Charles IV, nicknamed the Fair, died in February 1328 without a surviving male heir. Since Hugh Capet, elected king in 997, all French kings belonged to the direct Capetian line, which ensured a certain dynastic stability. The succession of Charles IV becomes a major issue. According to an interpretation of the Salic Law, a set of customary rules dating from the Merovingian dynasty, the crown of France cannot be transmitted through women. The choice therefore falls on Philip of Valois, cousin of Charles IV. Supported by the majority of the kingdom's lords, he is recognized as Philip VI, inaugurating the Valois dynasty. However, other lords contest this interpretation because, in fact, the question of transmission through women was not so clearly settled. This point will also be the legal basis on which the King of England, Edward III, will ground his claims. Edward III, born in 1312, has been King of England since 1327. He is also, through his mother Isabella of France, the grandson of King Philip IV the Fair and the nephew of Charles IV. When the latter dies, Edward III asserts that he is the legitimate heir to the throne of France, thus opposing the ascension of Philip VI of Valois. However, the French nobility overwhelmingly rejects the English sovereign's candidature, fearing that direct English control would transform France into a mere annexed possession. Nevertheless, this opposition also betrays broader concerns. If England were to rule over France, it would challenge the balance of the entire Christian West, in which the King of France holds a special status and prestige. In the 14th century, Flanders, a region primarily encompassing part of present-day Belgium and areas in northern France, is one of the most dynamic economic centers in Europe. Flemish cities like Ghent and Bruges prosper thanks to the cloth industry, a sector essential to the region's development. However, this cloth industry relies heavily on a primary raw material, wool, which is largely imported from England. This commercial flow creates a relationship of interdependence between Flanders and England, leading the Count of Flanders and the burghers of the Flemish cities to juggle between their political status, vassals or allies of the King of France, and their economic interests, ensuring the continuity of the supply of English wool. Philip VI, in his capacity as King of France, intends to maintain an influence over a prosperous region like Flanders, as the taxes and profits it generates are considerable for the crown. On his side, Edward III, if he manages to rally the Flemish to his cause, benefits from not only an economic advantage, the guarantee of a market for his wool, but also a military and political one. The geographical proximity of Flanders to France allows for logistical support to English troops in the event of conflict. The two sovereigns thus enter into a diplomatic struggle to influence Flanders, neutralize it, or secure its alliance. The Flemish burghers, on their side, use this rivalry to their advantage, negotiating privileges and commercial freedoms. This tension around Flanders creates a hub of discord that will quickly turn into a strategic showdown, contributing to the outbreak. Beyond Flanders, other territories are contested between France and England. The main one is Guyenne, sometimes called Aquitaine, a vast region in the southwest of France that then includes Bordeaux, an important center of the wine trade. For several decades, Guyenne has been under English domination, but Edward III is supposed to pay homage to the King of France for this possession, as it is legally a fief of the Kingdom of France. This paradoxical situation, a king rendering homage to another king for a territory, well symbolizes the complexity of feudal relations at the time. English kings fear French influence. On several occasions, the Capetian and Valois sovereigns have sought to pare down Guyenne, reducing its area or questioning the fiscal and judicial privileges enjoyed by the English in the region. Bordeaux, a major port city, is a nerve center for commercial exchanges. The region exports wine to England, but also receives cloth and other goods from the entire Anglo-Saxon world. The income from port taxes is substantial and feeds the English royal treasury. If this territory were integrated into the French royal domain, or at least severely stripped of its advantages, the English monarchy would lose an important source of revenue and influence on the continent. For Philip VI, it's also a question of sovereignty. He wishes to strengthen the king's direct authority over the entire French soil, and does not view favorably the persistent presence of a king-duke within his own borders. Border incidents, legal trials, and diplomatic disputes over the Guyenne are thus recurrent causes of discord. In this already overheated context, the publication of official acts, tense diplomatic exchanges, and military border incidents eventually break the fragile balance that still prevailed. When Edward III goes so far as to publicly proclaim his status as King of France and deploys a new policy of alliances with Flanders, escalation becomes inevitable. From Philip VI's side, the decision to confiscate certain English fiefs in France, notably in Guyenne, only fuels the anger of the English court. Slowly but surely, both camps are heading towards open war, a conflict that will last much longer than a single generation and will leave a lasting mark on the history of Europe, the 100 Years' War. In mid-14th century Europe, each sovereign seeks to form powerful coalitions. For Edward III, the great challenge is to find allies on the continent who can support his offensives militarily and financially. Flanders plays a key role. The Flemish bourgeoisie often aligns with English positions to preserve their commercial interests. In the Holy Roman Empire, some princes are willing to conclude occasional alliances with Edward III. Internal political rivalries within the empire, the desire to counterbalance French power, and the promise of Allied financing, linked to the prospect of territorial gains or commercial advantages, encouraged several German lords to support England. At the beginning of the conflict, all these alliances enable Edward III to establish a strategic network on the continent. The first major naval confrontation of the 100 Years' War takes place in June 1340 off the coast of L'Ecluse, now Sluis in Zeeland, Netherlands. Edward III, seeking to prevent French reinforcements from threatening the English coasts or blocking his own movements on the continent, attacks Philip VI's fleet. The English victory is clear. Thanks to better equipped ships and especially superior tactics, the French fleet suffers heavy losses. This battle holds significant strategic importance. It ensures England maritime control in the Channel and the North Sea, thereby facilitating the transport of troops and the delivery of resources to conduct land campaigns in France. On French soil, the English strategy often involves chevauchées, which are rapid and destructive cavalry expeditions conducted on enemy territory. The English troops, well organized and led by experienced commanders, traverse the French countryside, plundering and burning crops, while generally avoiding large pitched battles to prevent exposure to overly risky frontal confrontations. These raids contribute to weakening the local economy and demoralizing the peasant population. They also aim to exhaust the morale of the French royalty, while forcing Philip VI to respond militarily on multiple fronts. A crucial date in this first phase of the war is August 26, 1346, the day of the Battle of Crécy in northern France. Edward III leads an army composed notably of archers equipped with the longbow, the English longbow, renowned for its superior range and firing rate compared to enemy archers. Facing them, Philip VI's army includes many heavily armed knights, symbols of the French nobility, as well as Genoese mercenaries equipped with crossbows. The battle opens under pouring rain, making the Genoese crossbows less effective, while the longbows, easier to reload, provide a clear tactical advantage. The successive charges of the French cavalry are disorganized by the dense volleys of the English archers. By the end of the day, the French army is decimated. Many nobles and knights perish on the battlefield. The psychological impact is enormous across Europe. The French chivalry, previously considered indomitable, finds itself humiliated. Edward III's victory proves that properly used infantry and light artillery can overcome a numerically superior but poorly coordinated force. In the wake of his victory at Crécy, Edward III decides to besiege the fortified city of Calais, located on the northern coast of France, at a strategic position controlling the strait linking the English Channel to the North Sea. The siege, begun in September 1346, lasts nearly a year and ends in August 1347 with the surrender of the French garrison. Aware of the city's geopolitical importance, the English crown transforms Calais into an advanced base, from which it becomes easier to conduct military operations on French territory. The possession of Calais also has a significant economic impact. The city becomes an almost obligatory transit point for trade between England, Flanders, and northern France. The local populations experience heavy fiscal pressure as England seeks to make this conquest profitable by levying taxes on goods passing through the port. For Philip VI, the fall of Calais is another severe blow, as it significantly reduces his ability to control maritime access in the north of the kingdom and gives Edward III a powerful bargaining tool in diplomatic negotiations. Even as France emerges from the ordeal of Crécy and the loss of Calais, a plague of unprecedented scale befalls Europe, the bubonic plague. Likely originating in Central Asia, it spreads via the main trade routes, notably those connecting the Mediterranean to northern Europe. The first traces appear in 1347, and the epidemic quickly spreads across the continent between 1347 and 1352. The Black Death, as it would later be called, decimates the population. Some estimates suggest that between a third and half of Europe's population died during those years. The consequences are devastating for agriculture and the economy. The countryside faces a labor shortage, and many lands go uncultivated. The armies themselves suffer heavy losses. The gathering of soldiers in unsanitary camps and constant movements help spread the disease. From a military standpoint, the plague imposes forced truces. Sovereigns struggle to raise new troops as mortality rises and the population's morale is at rock bottom. Edward III and Philip VI must deal with an unprecedented health crisis, which significantly slows down the war operations. This period of health-related withdrawal, however, does not lead to a definitive peace. Grievances remain, and as soon as the epidemic subsides somewhat, the fighting sporadically resumes. Beyond the battles, the Kingdom of France experiences a deep social crisis starting in the mid-14th century. In a country ravaged by war, where crops are often plundered and tax pressure increases to fund the military effort, discontent grows among the peasants. In 1358, the Great Jacquerie, a popular revolt of rare violence, erupts. The term Jacques is sometimes used pejoratively to refer to peasants, in reference to the jacque, a tunic they wore, and this Jacquerie far surpasses the usual rebellions. Groups of peasants rise up against the nobility, attacking castles, slaughtering lords, and seizing provisions. This revolt also resonates in urban uprisings, where the bourgeoisie, exasperated by the disorder and inefficiency of the government, opposes the nobility. In response to this movement, the royal power reacts quickly and brutally. Forces loyal to the king and several lords severely repress the insurgents. The leaders are executed without mercy. Politically, this peasant revolt highlights the distress of the French population, exhausted by war and the plague. Although it is quelled, the revolt forces a renegotiation of the respective roles and duties of the royalty, the lords, and the popular masses. The royal power understands to some extent that it must control internal violence if it wants to continue to resist English offensives. The fatigue caused by military campaigns, the demographic crisis linked to the plague, and social instability in France weigh heavily on both sides. England, despite its victories, is aware of the cost of a prolonged war on the continent. In France, the nobility and the royalty seek a respite to consolidate their positions and reduce the tax pressure that fuels the anger of the subjects. It is in this context that the Treaty of Bretigny is signed in May 1360, near Chartres. The negotiations involve King John II the Good, son and successor of Philip VI, who was taken prisoner during a later battle at Crécy at Poitiers in 1356. His ransom is one of the key points of the agreement. The ransom demanded by the English is colossal. It is said to be 3 million gold écus, an astronomical sum for the time. This treaty also includes significant territorial concessions. Aquitaine, until then subject to multiple disputes, is expanded and placed under the full sovereignty of Edward III, free from any homage to the King of France. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, France emerges from a challenging period marked by military defeats and the captivity of its king, John II the Good. This agreement, intended to bring a lasting end to hostilities with England, includes significant territorial concessions in favor of the English and the payment of a heavy ransom. However, these provisions do not resolve all tensions. The country remains weakened economically and socially. Many regions have been ravaged by raids, the countryside is struggling to recover from the pillaging, and the royal finances are nearly depleted. In this context, when Charles V, son of John II, ascends to the throne in 1364, he must immediately address the reorganization of the kingdom to prevent the disintegration of monarchical power. The new sovereign surrounds himself with competent advisors, tightens control over the provinces, and relies on military prudence to preserve the crown's meager resources. This strategy will mark a decisive step in the French reconquest and the affirmation of royal power. Upon his accession, Charles V realizes that mere martial vigor will not suffice to restore the monarchy's position. He knows how much the French population, tested by successive wars and the plague, longs for more stability. Thus, he implements significant administrative reforms aimed at strengthening institutions. The sovereign entrusts the management of finances to royal officers specialized in this field, some of whom report to the King's Council. He develops the structures of the central administration to improve tax collection and combat corruption, as every ECU must now be wisely spent. At the same time, Charles V encourages the construction or consolidation of municipal fortifications. The goal is to enable towns to better defend themselves against enemy incursions, while restoring the confidence of merchants and artisans who are a critical component of economic recovery. In return, the municipalities support the financial effort of the crown with new taxes, which are well accepted as they are precisely directed toward a stronger defense of the territory. This novel way of governing reflects the king's desire to modernize the country, rationalize expenditures, and put an end to the disorders born from the chronic instability of previous decades. In this reorganization, one character occupies a unique place, Bertrand du Guesclin. Born around 1320 in the county of Rennes, modern-day Brittany, he gained renown through his skills as a military leader and his dedication to the cause of the King of France, despite his Breton origin sometimes regarded as ambiguous. His bravery, tactical sense, and negotiation skills gradually earned him the trust of Charles V. When he was appointed Constable of France in 1370, du Guesclin became the main architect of the reconquest of territories that had fallen into English hands. His popularity among the soldiers was built on his repeated successes. He favored harassment tactics, avoiding large-scale pitched battles where the French nobility had often faltered in the past. These methods involved multiplying small skirmishes, ambushes, and intercepting enemy convoys. This war of attrition, less costly in human lives and resources, gradually exhausted the enemy and limited the risk of major setbacks. Du Guesclin also knew how to ally with the captains most loyal to the crown, reorganizing some bands of mercenaries who agreed to serve the king in exchange for regular pay and land grants. Thus, he transformed unruly bands into a better controlled military tool. Thanks to this complicity between the king and his constable, the Kingdom of France embarked on a partial reconquest of its territories, launched from the mid-1360s. Several English garrisons, scattered across the north and west of the country, were subjected to pressure from Du Guesclin and his lieutenants. Cities such as Monte, Moulins, and several strongholds in Normandy reverted to French authority thanks to shorter sieges made possible by better coordination among local nobles and royal officers. The English, for their part, struggled to mobilize sufficient fresh troops. The costs of occupation also depleted the English economy. The English king's fleet no longer had the same ease as before in supplying distant garrisons, as Charles V was attentive to securing the coastline and discreetly forged alliances with Flemish or Breton ports to restrict enemy ships' freedom of movement in the Channel. The French victories sometimes appeared modest, but they accumulated and significantly weakened the English occupation. Gradually, English possessions diminished, demonstrating the effectiveness of Du Guesclin's harassment strategy, supported by the reformative policy of Charles V. Despite these successes, the conflict did not end abruptly. The English retained important enclaves in Aquitaine, particularly around Bordeaux, as well as a few positions in Normandy. Both sides, exhausted by the series of military campaigns and the general crisis caused by war and epidemics, needed periods of truce. However, the negotiations conducted, often discreetly, did not result in a definitive peace. Each side preferred to maintain its dynastic and territorial claims in the hope of a more favorable balance of power in the future. This resulted in temporary ceasefires, sometimes strictly observed, sometimes broken by local raids or the furtive resumption of hostilities. Throughout this period, Charles V sought to strengthen the royal institution by reaffirming the monarchy's authority over the regional nobility and continuing the administrative reforms initiated at the start of his reign. The guiding idea was to prepare the kingdom for potential large-scale war resumptions. Meanwhile, Du Guesclin aimed to maintain pressure on the English enclaves to prevent any recovery by the adversary. This duo, fundamental in French history, embodied the resurgence of a centralized and more professional state, contrasting with the fragmentation that had threatened national unity at the beginning of the conflict. While the French camp works on its reformation, the situation deteriorates on the other side of the Channel. Edward III, King of England since 1327, approaches the end of his reign and sees his prestige erode. Once considered a vigorous and skillful monarch, he now has to contend with aging, illness, and the death of some close advisors. The skyrocketing cost of military campaigns in France weighs heavily on English society. The nobility begins to divide between those supporting the continuation of the conflict and those advocating withdrawal to consolidate the kingdom's resources. Merchants, in particular, suffer from the decrease in trade with the continent, even though the importance of English wool remains crucial for Flemish weavers. The royal finances, although better organized than in France in some respects, are about to reach their limits. Edward III dies in 1377, at the age of about 64. Leaving behind a country where managing the war legacy proves complex. His 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, succeeds him in an already weakened political environment. Richard II's ascent to the throne causes a wavering in the direction of the Kingdom of England. Given the youth of the new king, the Regency and the Royal Council are tasked with administering current affairs. The ambition to quickly reconquer lost territories in France clashes with unfavorable financial realities. New tax levies are then considered, provoking sharp discontent, especially among the most modest rural and urban classes. At the same time, the English nobility splits over what course to take and how to distribute fiscal burdens. Tensions grow between supporters of an aggressive policy on the continent, who wish to revive military operations to polish the monarchy's image, and those who believe internal reform should come first. This climate of political uncertainty is heightened by rivalry among some great families seeking to enhance their personal influence during the king's minority. The consequences of these divisions will become even more pronounced in the following years when the English populace, weary of an oppressive fiscal system and governmental indecision, will eventually revolt. One of the most famous popular uprisings of medieval England occurs in 1381, in the form of the Peasants' Revolt. Peasants, but also artisans and modest townspeople, organized to denounce the piling up of taxes imposed by the royalty and administrative abuses. These riots, led by figures like Wat Tyler, deeply shaked the English capital, London, where the insurgents managed to break through. Despite the brutal end of the movement, which sees repression fall on its instigators, this uprising shows just how internally weakened England is. While the young Richard II, then aged 14, attempts to reassert his authority, the very fact that a rural and urban revolution could threaten the heart of power highlights the growing difficulties of the English monarchy. Multiple issues remain unresolved: the kingdom's stability, the need to maintain a diplomatic front against Charles V, or the desire to retain a certain international prestige inherited from past great victories. On the military front, England still retains some important forces in key territories in France, but the dynamics of the war have clearly shifted in favor of the French camp under the cautious policy of Charles V and the strategic talents of Du Guesclin. In 1380, France finds itself under the recent reign of Charles VI, a young king who ascended to the throne at barely 12 years old. The premature death of Charles V deprived the country of an experienced monarch and left power to a turbulent regency. Several uncles of the young king, notably Louis of Anjou, John of Berry, and Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, vied for influence around the throne. This period of uncertainty dragged on and generated personal as well as political rivalries, paving the way for future internal fractures. Beyond the competition among his uncles, Charles VI himself, once of age and truly invested with power, showed signs of psychological fragility. Around 1392, he suffered his first bout of madness. During an expedition meant to punish a rebellious lord, the king flew into an uncontrollable rage, injuring several of his close advisors. This episode, known as the Madness of the King, surprised the court as much as the population and marked a tragic turning point. Subsequently, periods of lucidity alternated with phases of delirium, plunging the kingdom into a permanent state of confusion at the top of the state. The frequency of these mental crises increased the grip of a power-hungry nobility, with each of the great families of the court hoping to take advantage of the royal instability. The nickname Charles VI the Mad did not spread immediately, but the sovereign's contemporaries quickly noticed that his health made governance perilous. During delirious periods, the king no longer recognized his relatives, considered himself made of glass. A legend says he feared he would shatter if touched roughly, and sometimes withdrew into complete isolation. The management of the kingdom's affairs then fell either to his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, or to the princes of the blood, that is, members of the royal family or their relatives, all with one objective: to increase their influence and consolidate their territorial interests. To compensate for Charles VI's weaknesses, multiple short-lived regencies were established from the late 14th century. The king's uncles and cousins alternated on the royal council, each attempting to advance their agendas. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, distinguished himself in this role, having already demonstrated his governance skills in Flanders, where he had pursued a successful economic policy based on the cloth trade. John of Berry, for his part, was more focused on building lavish castles and artistic patronage, but he remained an influential actor. Louis of Orleans, Charles VI's younger brother, also eventually claimed a leading role in royal administration, a claim whose consequences would be dramatic for the kingdom's stability. In this context, the assassination of Duke Louis of Orleans in 1407 plunged France into open civil war. Louis of Orleans wielded significant political power, even interfering in foreign policy and bypassing the influence of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy, son of Philip the Bold. When Louis was killed in the streets of Paris, rumors quickly incriminated John the Fearless. He did not hide it. He eventually acknowledged his involvement, justifying his act by accusing Louis of Orleans of monopolizing royal power and squandering the kingdom's finances. Two factions then formed. On one side, the supporters of the Dukes of Burgundy, dubbed Burgundians, and on the other, the supporters of the Count of Armagnac, father-in-law to the young Charles of Orleans, son of the assassinated Louis, known as Armagnacs. The conflict quickly escalated. Exiles, plots, and uprisings followed one another. Some major French cities sided with the Burgundians, while others supported the Armagnacs. The ambitions of the nobles deeply eroded the kingdom's unity and further weakened the already faltering power of Charles VI, whose inability to mediate these conflicts was a direct result of his illness. On the ground, this civil war makes France vulnerable to any foreign intrusion, its nobility being divided between two rival factions that do not hesitate to negotiate separately with the English enemy to obtain military or diplomatic support. The Armagnacs, who claim a more direct loyalty to King Charles VI and his heir the Dauphin, consolidate their positions around the center and south of the country. The Burgundians, on the other hand, control a vast area including the rich regions of Flanders and the Duchy of Burgundy, benefiting from international commercial alliances. Thus, they have substantial financial resources, allowing them to maintain considerable armies. In this fratricidal struggle, the French people are the big losers. The pillaging of the countryside, the ransoms demanded from the cities, increasing taxes, and general insecurity weigh heavily on the morale of the population. While France sinks into a civil war, England is not free from internal troubles. Richard II, who ascended the throne in 1377 when he was just a child, gradually faces opposition from a part of the English nobility. As an adult, he attempts to strengthen royal power and punish overly independent lords, but his authoritarian methods and his preference for certain court favorites provoke growing discontent. However, in 1399, dissatisfaction reaches a point of no return. While he needs to suppress uprisings in Ireland, his opponents take the opportunity to undermine his authority. Upon his return, he is arrested and forced to abdicate. This event marks a major turning point in the history of England. The deposition of a legitimate king by an ambitious relative revives the old debate over dynastic legitimacy, which is crucial in the broader context of the 100 Years' War. While Richard II still hopes to retain the crown, he is handed over to his enemies and dies the following year, in 1400, probably from starvation or assassination in his prison. Henry of Lancaster, becoming Henry IV, seizes the throne by presenting himself as the defender of the people's rights and the privileges of Parliament against the despotism of his predecessor. However, this takeover does not erase the doubts about his legitimacy. Forming a new dynastic branch, the House of Lancaster, Henry IV must both resist attempts to restore Richard II or other potential heirs, and face hostility from influential nobles initially rallied to the deposed crown. This instability at the head of the kingdom confirms that England needs military and political consolidations to assert itself on the European stage. While the memory of great English victories against France remains vivid, the financial context is now more delicate. War is costly, and the barons demand more rigorous management of public funds. Henry IV, keen to maintain his authority, therefore seeks successes abroad, disrupting French trade or supporting certain French factions to exercise leverage. He also seizes any divisions among the enemy to negotiate advantageous treaties or even support one of the French factions, particularly Burgundy, against the other. The new King of England faces other challenges. His reign is marked by internal revolts, such as the Welsh rebellion led by Owain Glyndwr, who declares himself Prince of Wales and engages in strong resistance against royal authority. Moreover, several barons feel they have been sidelined from court favors and demand more influence in political decisions. Conversely, some rally to Henry IV in hopes of gaining titles and privileges. In Parliament, debates become more intense regarding the role that should be given to this assembly of the aristocracy and clergy in the conduct of affairs. Diplomatically, Henry IV knows that resuming open warfare against France might distract the rebellious barons, but the royal finances are not infinite. England's treasury is still affected by the cost of previous conflicts and the expeditions launched by Edward III, not to mention the impact of the Black Death on demographics and the economy. In this climate, alliances are being reshaped in a fluctuating manner. France, torn apart by the rivalry between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, no longer displays the unity that had allowed it, a few decades earlier, to present a common front against the English enemy. The Burgundians, thanks to their possessions in the wealthy Flanders, strengthen their commercial ties with England. English drapers sell their wool in Flanders and reap significant profits. For its part, Henry IV's England sees the Burgundian alliance as a way to undermine the position of the French Dauphin, heir to Charles VI, and to maintain instability in the rival kingdom. Into this already highly geopolitical panorama is added a major spiritual and political factor, the Western Schism, which broke out in 1378. Since that date, two rival popes, and later even three, each claim to be the legitimate head of Christianity. One resides in Rome, the other in Avignon and Provence. This division causes a fragmentation of Western Christendom because each kingdom or principality chooses to recognize one pope or the other based on its interests. France, traditionally close to the Avignon papacy, finds itself embarrassed by the upheavals related to the Civil War and the mental state of its sovereign. The Burgundians sometimes lean towards positions more favorable to the Roman Pope to show autonomy from Charles VI and Isabeau of Bavaria, often close to the Avignon Pope. England, for its part, oscillates depending on which pope is better able to endorse its political ambitions, knowing that the papacy holds, in principle, a moral power over the sovereigns. Furthermore, the German princes making up the Holy Roman Empire are also torn about the schism issue, further weakening their cohesion in the face of continental challenges. This schism is not limited to a distant theological quarrel. In an era where the Catholic religion is omnipresent, the divine legitimization of power matters greatly. Being supported or excommunicated by one of the popes can justify or, on the contrary, undermine a king's legitimacy. Among ordinary subjects, this duplication of spiritual authority sows confusion about whom to obey and which pontiff to honor in prayers. States, meanwhile, use this schism as a negotiation tool, promising allegiance to one pope in exchange for political support against their adversaries. The partisans of the Armagnacs and the Burgundians also exploit this lever. A bishop might, for instance, emphasize the need to obey the Avignon Pope, while another might advocate for the supremacy of the Roman Pope, depending on the desired orientation. In this tangle, France appears particularly diminished in the eyes of international observers. Its king, Charles VI, is no longer able to reign effectively. The uncles and cousins governing in his name are in open conflict, and the populace, exhausted by successive taxes and conscriptions, endures the de facto anarchy that reigns in certain provinces. The English, in turn, closely monitor the evolution of the civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. England knows it could benefit from a France brought to its knees to demand territorial concessions or claim once again the French crown, as Edward III once did. The following years see the rise of an increasingly central figure, Henry, the son of Henry IV, who becomes the heir apparent of England. Henry V is crowned in 1413, at the age of 26. Heir to the Lancastrian dynasty, he is determined to restore English glory on the continent. Now, Henry V aims to assert his rights to the French crown, theoretical rights inherited from the Plantagenet dynasty, and sustained by decades of crossed claims. In this context, his coming to power marks a turning point. England is ready to reactivate a dormant conflict and deploy vast military resources to seize the French throne. Henry V very quickly surrounds himself with the best advisors and military figures in his kingdom. The experience gained from previous campaigns of the 100 Years' War, along with several years of internal strife in England, has taught him how crucial logistical preparation and rapid intervention are. He invests heavily in the training, arming, and training of his army. The English archers remain his key asset. Equipped with the longbow, they can fire multiple arrows per minute at a good distance, which proves fatal for heavy cavalry. Henri V's entourage also makes diplomatic efforts. He seeks to secure the support of certain German princes, maintain the goodwill of wealthy Flemish merchants, and stay on good terms with the Holy Roman Emperor. These alliances and financial agreements guarantee him funds to recruit mercenaries, buy ammunition, and charter transport ships. In 1415, Henri V chooses to launch his offensive in France, citing King Charles VI's refusal to recognize his claims. His primary goal is to strike quickly and hard to impress the French nobility and consolidate the legitimacy of his claims. He bets on an amphibious expedition, crossing the Channel in August 1415, establishing a strong foothold on Norman soil, and, if possible, forcing the French to accept a pitched battle. By mid-August, the English fleet anchors near the Seine estuary. Henri V's troops first capture the port city of Harfleur, a strategic site that controls the estuary and allows the regular arrival of reinforcements and supplies. The English lay siege to the city for several weeks, suffering significant losses due to French resistance and epidemics. Once Harfleur is captured in September 1415, Henri V deems it unwise to station there too long. He wants to reach Calais to winter there. It is then that the hastily assembled French army attempts to block the way. The encounter takes place on October 25th, 1415, near the village of Agincourt in northern France. The forces present are quite contrasting. On the English side, historians estimate between 6,000 and 10,000 soldiers, with a large proportion of archers. On the French side, the numbers generally range from 12,000 to 20,000 men, mainly heavily equipped knights and foot soldiers. The French, confident in their numerical superiority and the strength of their cavalry, neglect the importance of the terrain. However, the chosen area is narrow, muddy due to the preceding day's rain, and flanked by woods that complicate maneuvers. In the morning freshness, Henri V takes a defensive position. He orders his archers to carve stakes, angled towards the enemy, to protect their positions. When the French cavalry advances, it is met with a deluge of arrows. The horses, weakened by the muddy ground, panic and disorganize the lines. This initial chaos turns into a large-scale disaster for the French nobility. Pressed against each other in the narrow clearing, the knights struck by arrows can neither retreat nor charge effectively. The English take advantage of this confusion and continue to pepper the enemy ranks, then engage in hand-to-hand combat with the fallen or immobilized French. In a few hours, the battle concludes with a crushing English victory. The number of French dead, notably among the high nobility, is considerable. Several great lords and knights, symbols of Capetian chivalry, perish on this muddy field of Agincourt. For the French army, morale collapses. For Henri V, the prestige and aura of victory are immense. This military success, widely reported by English chroniclers, casts a long shadow over the French monarchy, already shaken by King Charles VI's mental instability and the internal struggles between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. Henri V can then, with his victorious army, return to Calais and then to England, where he is welcomed as a liberator and a national hero. Henri V, emboldened by the psychological impact of Agincourt, launches a new offensive in 1417. This time, he targets France's wealthiest province, Normandy. Rich in agriculture and thriving commercial towns, Normandy also hosts numerous strongholds from which the French kings can monitor the English Channel. From a strategic standpoint, capturing Normandy would provide the English with a remarkable springboard, offering them almost direct access to their island territory. Motivated by these prospects, Henri V embarks on an ambitious new campaign. London supports this plan by providing funds and encouraging the raising of additional troops, while Breton and Gascon mercenaries, attracted by the pay, rally under the English banner. For 2 years, from 1417 to 1419, the towns and castles of Normandy fall one after the other. Caen falls in 1417, Alençon opens its gates under threat, and in January 1419, after a long and grueling siege, Rouen capitulates. At that time, Rouen is one of the main cities of the Kingdom of France, dynamic, densely populated, and strategically positioned on the Seine. Its capture by the English is not only a military triumph, it deals a severe blow to the prestige of the King of France, already weakened, and places in enemy hands a crucial location for controlling the entire region. The English establish a methodical occupation, levy new taxes, and requisition resources. Economically, the local population often finds itself suffocated by fiscal pressure. The Norman towns now held by English garrisons are strictly monitored. Any hint of revolt is suppressed. Bourgeois deemed hostile are financially punished or, in some cases, imprisoned. Chroniclers of the time report abuses, but others argue that the English, aware of Normandy's economic importance, seek instead to preserve the commercial fabric to profit from it. Regardless, these years mark the implementation of a well-thought-out occupation policy, serving the ambitions of Henri V. The rising star of the English king soon provokes reactions among the princes of the Kingdom of France. The French court, divided for several years, finds itself facing a major threat, fearing that Henri V will further expand his dominion. The Dukes of Burgundy, in conflict with the Armagnacs, see it more as an opportunity. They negotiate behind the scenes, hoping to capitalize on King Charles VI's weakness and forge a favorable alliance with England. These negotiations result in the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a document that will upend the succession to the French throne. Indeed, Henri V marries Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, and is designated as heir to the Kingdom of France upon Charles VI's death. The Dauphin Charles, son of Charles VI, and thus the legitimate heir according to Capetian tradition, is thereby sidelined. The treaty marginalizes him completely by implicitly branding him an usurper, relegating him to his meager possessions in the south of the kingdom. The Burgundians, on their part, consolidate their de facto alliance with the English. They retain their own territories and hope, in the long run, to play a significant role in the future Franco-English government. The political scope of this treaty is immense. For the first time in the history of the French monarchy, a foreign sovereign is theoretically called to reign over France by contractual means, rather than the mere dynastic law. Contemporaries, particularly those loyal to the Capetian tradition, cry out in scandal. But military reality leaves them with few options. Henri V has demonstrated on the battlefields that he possesses superior military and financial means. The signing of the Treaty of Troyes symbolizes the peak of English power on French soil since the beginning of the 100 Years' War. The major cities, beginning with Paris, effectively bow to this situation. The Dauphin Charles is left with only a narrow domain around Bourges and a few cities in the Loire Valley. The nobility hesitates between siding with King Charles VI, now almost incapacitated to rule, or acknowledging the authority of the de facto new master, Henri V, reinforced by the support of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. However, this brilliant British triumph is quickly tarnished by a twist of fate. On August 31st, 1422, Henry V dies suddenly, succumbing to an illness. Some chroniclers mention dysentery during another campaign in France. His sudden death at the age of 35 creates a void at the top of the power structure. Considered an exceptional warrior leader, he left his country in a dominant position, but not yet fully consolidated. The death of Henry V occurs as Charles VI, the King of France, is himself on the verge of passing away. He dies in October 1422. The Treaty of Troyes nevertheless stipulates that the crown should pass to Henry V and his descendants. However, the son of the King of England, Henry VI, is still just a baby. He becomes King of England at 9 months old, and according to the signatories of the Treaty of Troyes, de jure King of France. In reality, the situation is more complex. The regency in England and France is managed by two key figures. In England, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, is entrusted with a prominent role, while in France, it is primarily the Duke of Bedford, brother of Henry V, who acts as regent of the conquered territories and strives to maintain the Burgundian alliance. The Duke of Bedford, an experienced strategist, is committed to preserving the Norman conquests, ensuring control of the capital Paris, and orchestrating propaganda in favor of his young nephew, Henry VI, presented as the legitimate heir of Charles VI. These complicated regencies risk weakening England, whose political class is accustomed to strong and feared monarchs. For now, the military successes achieved since Agincourt maintained the enthusiasm of some English barons, and the immense loot drawn from the campaigns in France silences certain dissenters. However, in the Kingdom of France, distrust is brewing. The Dauphin Charles, officially disinherited, refuses to submit. Assisted by a few loyal advisors, He attempts to consolidate his base in the south, notably around the city of Bourges, which serves as his unofficial capital. Although his treasury and army are limited, he remains the legitimate son of Charles VI in the eyes of many French. The populations grow weary of occupations, taxes, and abuses, and even among supporters of the Burgundian party, there is sometimes fear of excessive English control. But, for the time being, the Duke of Bedford manages the situation. The Anglo-Burgundian forces dominate most of the north and northeast of France, control essential economic areas, and can quickly dispatch disciplined troops in case of revolt. In the spring of 1429, the military and political situation in France seems desperate. The Dauphin Charles then resides in the town of Chinon, located in the Loire Valley in the west of France. He dwells there to escape the advance of English and Burgundian troops who control vast territories of the kingdom. For several years, this prince, son of the late King Charles VI, has doubted his legitimacy and the support of his own vassals. The country's economy is depleted, civilians suffer from the ravages of war, and the few partisans of the Dauphin are increasingly worried about their sovereign's impotence in the face of enemy progress. The major French cities of the north, like Rouen and Paris, are under Anglo-Burgundian authority. The prestigious city of Reims, where French kings have traditionally been crowned for centuries, is also under their control. This symbolic loss is all the more significant as the coronation ceremony in the Cathedral of Reims founds the legitimacy of a French monarch in everyone's eyes. In this context, Charles struggles to gather significant troops. His advisors are divided on the conduct of military operations, and his finances no longer allow him to maintain a regular army. The soldiers who remain by his side lack morale and rely on the resources of regions still loyal, notably Berry, Anjou, and a few other enclaves of loyalists. On the international scene, the English grip on France seems solidly established. Communications with England are well assured, especially from the Norman ports, and the boy king Henry VI is presented as the archetype of the union of the two crowns. The supporters of the Dauphin Charles retreat and try to maintain the idea that he is, in reality, the only legitimate sovereign according to the Capetian tradition. Their propaganda also highlights the growing misery of a country in perpetual war. In the cities still loyal to the Dauphin, hope is dwindling. Chronicles of the time describe a kingdom split in two, without possible alliance, where each camp spies on the other, while the weary people pray for peace to return. England, for its part, faces a significant challenge, transforming a military conquest into a sustainable government of a French-speaking population attached to its customs and legal traditions. It is in this heavy and uncertain climate, where many believe that France is on the brink of collapse, that an unexpected intervention will change the course of events. A young woman from the east of the country, claiming to be guided by divine voices, is about to appear on the war stage. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 into a family of small farmers near the contested border between the Kingdom of France and the Duchy of Lorraine. Her village of Domremy, modest and rural, is located in a region marked by conflicts, enemy incursions, and economic difficulties. From her adolescence, Joan claims to receive divine messages, which she attributes to celestial voices. She specifically describes hearing Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who urge her to support the Dauphin Charles, to lift the siege of Orléans, and to lead the king to the coronation at Reims. In a deeply religious 15th century France, these affirmations resonate strongly at the time. The belief in divine assistance remains deeply rooted, and the figure of the Maid, perceived as a messenger from God, draws attention from populations longing for hope. Convinced of the sacred nature of her mission, Joan leaves her village and seeks the support of the Lord of Baudricourt, royal captain at Vaucouleurs. Initially skeptical, he eventually agrees to recommend her to the Dauphin Charles. Joan then crosses several hostile territories, reaches Chinon, and presents herself at the court. Her arrival constitutes an extraordinary event, a young woman of humble condition making her way among seasoned warriors, requesting an audience to speak directly to the son of Charles VI. The Dauphin, struck by the assurance and fervor of this unknown young woman, questions her at length. Despite the mistrust of some advisors, he is won over by her speech. To dispel any suspicion of heresy or deception, Joan is subjected to an ecclesiastical examination in Poitiers, where the clerics eventually conclude that her approach is sincere. Authorized to pursue her mission, she is then given a small army that she will soon lead to the rescue of the besieged city of Orléans. The Siege of Orléans in 1429 is a decisive moment in the Hundred Years' War. Since October 1428, the English have surrounded this strategic city on the Loire. Their objective is clear: to gain control of this waterway, to split the kingdom in two, and facilitate the conquest of the south. The defenders of Orléans, exhausted and threatened by famine, expect a final assault. When Joan arrives on the eve of April 29th, 1429, the inhabitants welcome with relief and exultation the one who comes under the auspices of Providence. Donning armor, wielding her banner adorned with holy images, Joan galvanizes the French troops. Quickly, she identifies the weak points in the English setup, encourages counterattacks, and directly leads several victorious assaults. Her bravery in the fray, her unwavering faith in the legitimacy of the Dauphin, and her ability to restore confidence to the soldiers transform the complexion of this battle. To everyone's astonishment, Orléans is liberated on May 8, 1429, after the English lift the siege. The resounding success has a significant impact. It halts the English advance and shakes the morale of both camps. On the French side, the victory at Orléans suddenly sparks a renewed sense of pride and enthusiasm. Lords who had previously been indecisive start considering pledging allegiance to the Dauphin Charles. The soldiers, meanwhile, become convinced that they can turn the tide of the war. Among the English ranks, the liberation of Orléans creates surprise and reveals the power of this movement, led by a young woman who claims to be on a divine mission. On a diplomatic level, Jeanne's exploit weakens the propaganda that depicted Charles as a sovereign incapable of victory. The strategic value of Orléans, a gateway to the center of France, is thus preserved, and the prospect of a coronation in Reims, previously deemed illusory, reemerges. Encouraged by the success at Orléans, Jean immediately urges the Dauphin to continue the offensive and march toward Reims to be crowned in keeping with the tradition of French kings. The stakes are highly symbolic, since the baptism of Clovis, the founder of the Kingdom of France, at the end of the 5th century, the coronation ceremony in the Reims Cathedral has consecrated the legitimacy of a French sovereign. The king is anointed with the oil of the Holy Ampoule, a precious vial kept in the city, symbolizing dynastic continuity. Jeanne insists that the coronation will fully legitimize Charles in the eyes of the kingdom and will strengthen the allegiance of lords and people often tempted to seek protection under the English or Burgundian banners. During the summer of 1429, the road to Reims turns out to be strewn with pitfalls. The English and their Burgundian allies still control many strongholds, particularly in the regions north of the Loire. With a relatively small army, Charles fears venturing too far, fearing being encircled or defeated. Yet, supported by Jeanne and some trusted captains, he finally decides to undertake the endeavor. The ensuing campaign, often referred to as The Ride to Reims sees the Dauphin's forces successively capture key towns in the Loire Basin and in northern Champagne. At each stage, the inhabitants open their doors to the royal army, so much the reputation of the Maid precedes and instills fear in the enemy, fervor among the Dauphin's supporters. However, near Troyes, the troops must force entry, as the city initially resists. An agreement is eventually reached, avoiding a prolonged siege that would have slowed the progression toward Reims. On July 17, 1429, Charles, now buoyed by this series of successes, enters the Reims Cathedral to receive the coronation. Jeanne d'Arc, clad in her armor, proudly holds her banner by his side, manifesting the very reason for her mission. The coronation ceremonies unfold according to traditional ritual. Charles is anointed with the holy ampoule and receives the royal insignia. At the end of the service, Jeanne kneels before Charles VII and formally addresses him as the legitimate King of France. The symbolic impact is immense. For the public opinion of the time, the royal anointment validated by the high clergy at the historic site of all coronations strengthens Charles VII's position. Many lords and princes who, from that moment, choose to leave the Anglo-Burgundian camp to rally to the King of Reims. Paris remains in the hands of the English, as do many northern cities, but the psychological and diplomatic effect of the coronation at Reims is considerable. For the first time in years, there is belief in the prospect of a total victory against the enemy. Jeanne d'Arc becomes the uncontested heroine of the Reconquest movement, and her fame transcends French borders. Indeed, the ceremony at Reims accelerates rallying movements. Lords hitherto neutral or even hostile now find it more prudent or profitable to move closer to the newly recognized king. In the southern territories, in the Massif Central, or in the eastern part of the kingdom, royal propaganda emphasizes the almost miraculous nature of the liberation of Orléans and the sacred nature of the coronation. Noble houses, sometimes linked to the English by default, reconsider their alliances. Even though the royal army is not yet powerful enough to launch a major offensive toward the entire north, it snatches victories and dismantles the image of English invincibility. Continuing on this path, Jeanne encourages Charles to retake the capital, Paris, a major symbol of royal power. However, this operation fails in the fall of 1429. The city's defenses are strong, and the Parisian populace, fearing possible reprisals, does not rise up to welcome Jeanne. Understanding that Paris will not fall so easily, Charles opts to wait, preferring to consolidate his authority over already acquired territories and negotiate possible truces with the Burgundians. Jeanne, on her part, does not give up. Despite some strategic differences with the royal advisors, she continues her ideal of quickly bringing the entire country under Charles VII's authority. The year 1430 marks a painful turning point for Jeanne. In May, while attempting to defend the town of Compiègne, located north of Paris, she is captured by Burgundian troops led by the bastard of Vendôme. Compiègne is then threatened by a coalition seeking to further destabilize the fragile balance established since Reims. Jeanne commands a sortie to drive out the besiegers, but finds herself isolated during a counterattack. She is thrown from her horse and fails to escape. The Burgundian soldiers, aware of holding a prisoner of great value, hand her over to the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. He seeks to monetize this military and political asset as best as he can. Finally, the young woman is sold to the English, who see her as the main instrument of their recent setbacks in France. Once they have their prisoner in hand, the English transfer Jeanne to Rouen, the main seat of their administration in Normandy. There, she is imprisoned under particularly harsh conditions, closely watched by guards who fear a possible coup to free her. For the English, the stakes are high. The goal is to discredit her mission, and by extension, the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation. In a France where the Church holds considerable moral power, the best weapon to break the aura of the Maid is an ecclesiastical trial for witchcraft, heresy, and other crimes against the faith. The English hoped to prove that Jeanne acted under the influence of the devil, thus tarnishing Charles VII's reputation as king, consecrated with the help of a supposed witch. The trial, conducted by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, himself close to the English, begins in February 1431. The interrogations extend over several months. Jeanne repeatedly testifies to her Christian faith and reaffirms the divine nature of her voices. She has no lawyer nor any ecclesiastical advisor to defend her. The judges, mostly favorable to the English cause, seek to trap her on doctrinal subtleties, particularly on obedience to the Church, the real nature of her visions, and her military attire. Wearing men's clothes is considered scandalous in the medieval moral order. Despite a certain courage and strength of spirit that is evident in the minutes of the trial, Jeanne finds herself increasingly cornered. In May 1431, the ecclesiastical court concludes with Jeanne's condemnation for heresy, relapse, return to error after a first warning, and practices deemed contrary to the faith. Various pressures are then exerted to make her recant, that is, publicly renounce her statements about her divine voices. Fearing death, Jeanne signs a brief act of abjuration, then soon retracts, once again affirming the reality of her celestial mission. This volte-face is perceived as an admission of relapse, definitively sealing her fate. On May 30th, 1431, she is led to the stake erected in the Old Market Square in Rouen. Barely 19 years old, she dies burned alive, surrounded by English guards under the helpless or indifferent eyes of many spectators. Her courage in facing death, her prayers, her cry invoking Jesus, resonate in contemporary accounts, leaving a lasting impression on people's minds. Politically, the execution of Joan of Arc was intended as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge English authority or disrupt the established order. However, this decision aroused deep unease among the public. The execution of a young heroine, who had aided Orleans and led Charles VII to the coronation at Reims, appeared to many as an act of vengeance, not an act of justice. In France, she left a considerable void. Some lords who had recently rallied to the king felt destabilized by the loss of someone who so strongly symbolized the national revenge. Others, on the contrary, became more radical in their opposition to England, seeing in Joan's martyrdom proof that the invader no longer hesitated to use ecclesiastical institutions for political purposes. The image of the Maid, ready to die for her faith and for the freedom of the kingdom, gained in power. Far from discrediting Charles VII, her trial and condemnation gradually fueled an anti-English sentiment and strengthened the cause of the Valois monarchy. In the eyes of posterity, Joan of Arc quickly became a patriotic, religious, and moral symbol. Her initial humility, total dedication to the royal cause, and her status as a young woman made her a unique figure in the medieval landscape, largely dominated by male war leaders and complex political intrigues. Even her execution, designed to vilify her, transformed her into a martyr for the French nation. Many chroniclers of the time recount with emotion her last day, her prayer, and the manner in which her ashes were thrown into the Seine to prevent any worship around her remains. Her memory, maintained by both the clergy and historians, would endure for centuries, eventually becoming an essential part of the French collective imagination, and much later, a saint canonized by the Catholic Church in 1920. In the first half of the 1430s, Charles VII understood that he needed to consolidate his throne, still largely contested. His initially fragile support grew stronger as he demonstrated political skills that some had not suspected. Surrounded by astute advisors and experienced military leaders, he gradually undertook the elimination of internal threats. The king managed to restore order in regions loyal to his authority while skillfully negotiating with various princes of the blood to end the civil discord that had haunted the kingdom for several decades. Charles VII's military reforms, often considered a major turning point, are particularly noteworthy. Since the beginning of the Hundred Years' War, the French monarchy had suffered from disorganized forces, sometimes relying on private captains, sometimes on scattered troops lacking discipline or stable funding. To address these deficiencies, the king instituted the companies of ordonnance. He regulated and professionalized the forces, ensured the loyalty of the officers, and established stable funding. These companies of ordonnance constituted the nucleus of an army capable of standing up to the formidable English archers. Their maintenance was costly, forcing the crown to reform its taxation, but the effort proved worthwhile as it provided the French with a solid and disciplined striking force. Simultaneously, the king worked to strengthen the royal administration. To limit abuses and corruption, he entrusted more and more powers to the parliaments and bailiffs, royal officers. He also multiplied ordinances aimed at equipping the kingdom with more stable institutions, notably for tax collection and the administration of justice. Centralization accelerated. The king's representatives traveled the territory, collected taxes, and ensured that royal decrees were applied. Charles VII's authority no longer relied solely on symbolic prestige, but on a regular and efficient organization. Based on these reforms and newfound confidence, Charles VII sends his captains on a methodical reconquest of the territory. Starting from the mid-1430s, the French army gradually recovers strategic locations held by the enemy. Among these resounding successes is the recapture of Paris in 1436. Since 1420, the capital had been under Anglo-Burgundian influence, which constituted a highly symbolic issue. Possession of Paris equated to embodying legitimacy over the Kingdom of France. Its recovery, though marked by skirmishes, threats of reprisals, and political tensions, represents a massive triumph. In the eyes of the Parisian population and foreign princes, Charles VII now appears as a sovereign, both firm and diplomatic, capable of rallying the citizens to his cause. After reclaiming the capital, the king and his advisors do not let up in their efforts. The French continue their operations in the north of the country, a crucial region for the kingdom's commerce and prosperity. The noose tightens around the cities in the hands of England and its allies. Many inhabitants hope to see order restored so they can resume their economic activities. However, military campaigns are conducted cautiously. The approach is methodical, aiming to preserve royal forces, avoid overly risky pitched battles, and prevent unnecessary destruction. This slow reconquest, spanning several years, eventually puts pressure on Burgundy, a longtime ally of the English. Throughout the conflict, the dynasty of the Dukes of Burgundy played a complex role, alternating between alliances and rivalries with the French crown. Duke Philip the Good, having concluded treaties with the English, had distanced himself from the royal Valois branch, and for a time, supported English ambitions. However, several factors gradually lead to a shift in Burgundy towards reconciliation with Charles VII. First, the French military progress makes the prospect of an exclusive alliance with England less attractive. Additionally, Charles II's growing power offers Duke Philip the possibility to consolidate his own position, provided he negotiates a profitable agreement. On September 21, 1435, following long negotiations, the Treaty of Arras was signed. It's a pivotal moment that changes the course of the war. Charles, as a seventh, accepts certain compromises, such as the recognition of some Burgundian privileges and reparations for the assassination of John the Fearless. In return, Philip the Good gradually distances himself from the English alliance and approaches the French throne. Politically, this reconciliation has immense repercussions. Deprived of Burgundian support, England finds itself increasingly isolated on the continent. Its supply bases dwindle, provisioning its garrisons becomes arduous, and its diplomatic influence weakens. For Charles VII, this marks a major diplomatic success. Not only does he strengthen his authority, but he also manages to diffuse a civil war that risked lingering. The Treaty of Arras thus marks a turning point in the conflict. The momentum is now in favor of the French, who advance towards the full reconquest of their lands. In the years that follow, the strengthening of the alliance between France and Burgundy further enhances Charles VII's aura, contributing to reshaping the map of power dynamics in Western Europe. Following this treaty, the French royal power gains a second wind. The country, scarred by decades of battles, looting, and famines, finds respite in the regions restored to the king's control. The nobility, eager to rebuild their domains, draws closer to a sovereign who has proven his ability to govern. Furthermore, Burgundy's disengagement disrupts British plans. Now, the English can no longer rely on a powerful neighbor to relieve their troops. This reality gradually results in military defeats and declining morale within the garrisons still stationed in France. Centralization accelerated then, as Charles VII took advantage of each victory to firmly establish his institutions. New ordinances, signed in the 1440s, confirmed the reorganization of the armed forces. Captains, previously autonomous, were now under strict control of the crown, and the financial organization allowed for raising more taxes than before. The king's ambassadors traveled across France and neighboring Europe, fostering diplomatic relations conducive to economic reconstruction. Gradually, the kingdom emerged from its long period of internal conflict to become once again a credible power, influential in continental affairs. In the second half of the 1440s, with a better disciplined army, Charles VII prepared for the total reconquest of Normandy and Guyenne, these two provinces being strategically and economically vital for the crown. The English found themselves in the opposite situation. Despite some heroic resistance, they no longer had the superiority that had once allowed them to triumph. They lacked financial resources, struggled to reinforce their troops, and also suffered internal strife that weakened their ability to act. On April 15, 1450, the Battle of Formigny in Lower Normandy illustrated this shift in power. The English forces, commanded by Thomas Kyriel, attempted to halt the reconquest of the duchy, vital for the English monarchy since the early years of the conflict. But the French army, led by, among others, the Count of Clermont and the Constable of Richemont, used its artillery and organization to crush the English. The day ended in a heavy defeat for the latter, who lost not only several hundred men, but also effective control of much of Normandy. Symbolically, Formigny marked the end of a lasting English presence in this province, once held by the strength of the longbow and the myth of English invincibility. After Formigny, the English had only Guyenne and the city of Bordeaux left, historically linked to England via the Plantagenet dynasty. However, these lands were also in Charles VII's sights. In the summer of 1453, the King of France's troops, led by Jean Bureau, one of the pioneers of modern French artillery, succeeded in drawing the English army into a confrontation near Castillon in Aquitaine. The power of the French cannons, judiciously positioned and defended by fortifications, surprised the adversary. One of the English leaders, John Talbot, died during the confrontation. Without him, the English ranks fell into disarray and suffered a crushing defeat. The fall of Bordeaux quickly followed, marking the end of English domination in the region. This victory practically sealed the outcome of the 100 Years' War, and while the date of 1453 is often fixed as the end of the war, it is primarily because nothing now prevented Charles VII from fully integrating Guyenne into the kingdom. While France caught its breath and consolidated its unity, England slid into serious succession and governance problems. King Henry VI, who ascended to the throne at just 9 months old, lacked the strength of his father, Henry V, the former conqueror of Normandy. Even during the war in France, the Regency and English nobility struggled to agree on a clear policy. The setbacks gradually suffered on the continent weakened royal authority, and by the 1450s, supporters of the House of York and those of the House of Lancaster were vying for control of power. This division was a major factor in the gradual loss of French possessions because England was no longer able to effectively mobilize its military resources. The nobility's attention then shifted to internal rivalry, which would eventually turn into a full-fledged civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, erupting in 1455. Consequently, the political will to pursue domination in France collapsed in favor of internal disputes. With the defeat at Castillon, the English understand that any project of reconquest is now out of reach. The military and financial toll is overwhelming. Normandy and Aquitaine are definitively lost. Paris is once again in the hands of the sovereign of France, and Burgundian support is no longer a reality. English resources, swallowed up in an endless conflict, are sorely lacking to defend on all fronts, notably at Calais, the last stronghold on the continent, which remains under English flag for a few more decades, but whose importance is now greatly reduced. Moreover, England must face its own internal crises, the youth and weakness of Henry VI, the varying influence of his entourage, and the rivalries between great lords all converge to make the pacification of the kingdom the absolute priority. Attempts to maintain dominance over France become unpopular, both among the people who bear the brunt of taxation and among part of the nobility, more concerned with strengthening their positions within England itself. Thus, around 1453, the 100 Years' War effectively comes to an end, without an official treaty to proclaim general peace. England turns inward, preparing to face its own upheavals, leading to a major retreat of its continental influence for many years. Thus ends, not with a solemn signature, but in exhaustion and silence, the longest war in history. 116 years of rivalry, conquests, and betrayals, where two powers clashed for a crown, but ultimately forged nations. It was not merely a conflict for lands or titles, it was a struggle for identity, for the very future of France and England. A war that, by itself, redrew the destiny of the West,